Hello and welcome to another episode of the FemiNinja Project. And thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. We have another fantastic guest today. His name is Neil McKinlay, and he is a meditation coach and facilitator who learned to meditate as a teenager when his swim coach taught him and his entire team one rainy Saturday night. He has spent his adult life studying and practicing embodied meditation. And during this time, he has led events of 100 plus people, both in person and online. Neil has also been a parent and partner, author, and competitive swim coach. In recent years, he also became a survivor as he recovers from a relationship with a dysfunctional spiritual mentor. Neil, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. It's really an honor, a privilege to be here today.
Oh, and it's an honor for me to have you and to meet you. You have a fantastic or fascinating story, let's just say. So I'm going to turn it over to you. And, you can start wherever you want to. You could even start on that rainy Saturday night as a teenager, which I find it fascinating that your swim coach taught you and your entire team how to meditate. And as I told you before we started recording, I did some competitive swimming in a recreational league when I was younger and growing up. And I wish somebody would have taught me how to meditate because it would have helped with my nerves an awful lot.
Well, I mean, in many ways, that's as good a place as any to begin. And, it was a very interesting time in my life. It was an interesting time in sport more generally. It was the late 1970s, the early 1980s, and what we now might call sports psychology was becoming more and more mainstream. But it was a process. It was becoming more and more mainstream. And so I happened to be part of a team where the coaches were interested in this. Not everyone was interested in this, but I was part of a team where the coaches were interested in this. And so we did what was back in those days, a whole bunch of weird things. We would do visualization, we would do progressive relaxation, we would do goal setting, all these things that sound like, well, yeah, of course you do that. But, back then it was like, wow, what are you doing? And part of this was the introduction, part of this, kind of suite of tools and skill sets that was shared with us was the introduction of meditation. And as you describe, I was away in Vancouver for a swim meet one weekend. And in order to keep the cost of the experience down, we rented 2 conference rooms in a hotel, and all the girls were in one conference room with one of the swim moms chaperoning. And the boys were in another conference room with the assistant coach at the time, chaperoning, keeping us in line. And on Saturday night, I remember it was dark, it was rainy. He said something along the lines of, "You want to learn how to meditate?" And I don't know what everyone else's reaction was, but I was and am a big music fan. And the Beatles were a big part of that fandom. And I knew the Beatles meditated. So I was like, this is great. Beatles do it. It must be good. So let's do it. And we sat down and we meditated. And in many ways, it speaks to my involvement to this day. At some level, I can't really explain why I meditate. Of course, I can at another level, but at some level, it's simply that there's something compelling about sitting down and settling in and slowing down. There's something intriguing about that. And that's what I felt that first night. It was like, so we sat there upright. I was on a rolled up sleeping bag. We closed our eyes. He gave us the instructions. And I remember partway through the instructions, my eyes just popped open. I was like, this is amazing. I don't know what this is, but this is amazing. And that was enough. That was kind of the hook that kept me with it for a number of years until I started to more formally train. And in many ways, it's the hook that keeps me going today. It's still that, wow, this is something. This is something. And so, yeah, that was my beginnings.
I'm really curious. What was the reaction from the rest of your teammates?
For the life of me, I cannot recall. I mean, I remember,
Wow.
So I can remember sitting on the rolled up sleeping bag. I can remember being instructed through the meditation session. And then I can remember all of us, unrolling our sleeping bags and going to bed. And I laid on the floor in that conference room, recapitulating what had happened in the meditation session. And, it's interesting you ask, never did I to any of my peers about that particular experience ever again. It wasn't that there was a cone of silence around it. It just never came up. I do know that some of us in the years that followed maintained a at least peripheral interest in the practice. But I'm not sure how many, if any, continued, certainly in the way that I have.
That's quite the testimonial in itself, just your response to the question when you said you had no idea. I mean, you were obviously so in your own being.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, when you ask that question, and I could feel my attention going out to my peers, whom I can't even recall who was there, I feel my attention going out to my peers. I'm like, okay, there's no one there, because my attention was so turned inward for that evening, which is really interesting.
So did you notice a difference in how you reacted to different situations, to other people, even how you were competing on the swim team? Did you notice anything else from that evening going forward that really you can recall, like, wow, this really helped my swimming, or this helped my relationships, or this just helped my anxiety?
Yeah, I noticed that I had a skill. I'm not sure I thought of it in those terms at the time, but I had a skill set or a tool that allowed me to settle my attention. The attention that might be dancing around, flitting about from how am I going to fall asleep tonight? I'm nervous about tomorrow's race. What am I going to do in the finals tonight? That kind of thing. I did have an awareness that I had that tool, and I did occasionally use it to great effect. Curiously, though, I did not use it as much as I might have. I could have used it a lot more. For me, it was a lot of work. It didn't come naturally. It was challenging. It took time and energy. And when I was in the midst of, competitive situations, that's what we're talking about here, I often found my attention would be elsewhere. But the few times that I did avail myself of that tool that I knew I had, that I used meditation to settle my attention, to sink into what was going on, and to find kind of an inner core of stillness and ease, the effects were really quite dramatic, quite memorable.
I love the fact that you call it a tool, because, that's what it is. It's a life skill and a tool that you have. And I'm also wondering if maybe when you're stepping up to the starting block, is maybe that's the time when you don't need it. You know what I mean? It's like when the adrenaline is starting to pump, and it's like, okay, I have that tool that I can rely on. But there are some times where you really need to just put it down and be in the moment with something else, especially when you're doing some kind of competition.
Yeah, I often found that that moment of stepping onto the block and the adrenaline that came with it was its own focusing experience. I mean, that's one of the things that adrenaline will do is really focus you in. Where I really, really needed and found the benefit of that tool was in the minutes and hours and days preceding that moment of stepping up on the block.
Did you use the power of visualization before your meets? Was this something that resonated with you? Did you just really, were you attracted more to the meditation, or did that visualization piece resonate with you as well?
Meditation was the one that really resonated, but the suite of tools that I took occasional advantage of would be meditation and visualization and goal setting. Those were three of the things. The progressive relaxation never really had a lot of resonance for me, but those three did. And those were tools that I used, again, regrettably, only occasionally, but to memorable effect.
I love that, your suite of tools. That's pretty good.
It was pretty good.
Okay, so now you're no longer a teenager. Now you're getting into your adulthood.
Yeah.
Was there a time where you just didn't practice meditation and then you picked it back up again as an adult? Or did you continue to practice and just became more interested as you got a little bit older?
Well, it remained so after that experience, after I stopped swimming, I continued to meditate for a while. I would put meditation in air quotes, or continued to meditate in air quotes, because I think largely what I did is I sat still and closed my eyes. I'm not really sure I had a technique or a practice that I was working with, but it kept my toe in the water.
Mhm.
At a certain point, it started to drift. It wasn't as much a regular presence in my life, even though I'm saying that it was irregular back in my
Mhm.
swimming days, but it became an even more regular practice in my life. And somewhere, it was probably about 30 years ago, I found myself um, craving, yearning for something that might help me work with my wild, woolly, wandering mind.
Mhm.
I was practicing yoga at the time, and the yoga that I was doing didn't speak to that
Mhm.
all that often. And I found myself craving that something that would
Mhm.
help me bring my always wandering mind back to this moment, this moment. And meditation was the natural candidate because of my
Mhm.
familiarity with it. And so, with that yearning kind of leading the way, I started to more formally study and train in the
Mhm.
practice of meditation.
And when did you decide that you wanted to become a teacher?
Well, after I stopped swimming
Mhm.
competitively,
Mhm.
I hopped out of the water, dried myself off, put on a shirt, and became a swim coach.
Mhm.
And um, I was a swim coach for probably, I think, close to 20 years.
Wow.
And then that ended quite suddenly. And throughout those 20 years, let's go back, throughout those 20 years, or the bulk of those 20 years, I was studying and practicing or formally training in meditation. I was working with two successive communities that are both rooted in Tibetan Buddhism, that both provided opportunities to engage formal curriculum and long retreats. And by the time that my coaching career ended, again, quite suddenly, um, I was relatively well versed in the teachings and practices, relatively well versed in the teachings and practices. So there I am. My coaching career has ended. I'm sitting at the kitchen table. I literally have my head in my hands, moaning, like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And my wife walked by, and I don't know that she stopped. I think she just walked by, going from
Mhm.
point A to point B. And she said, well, you're trained in meditation. Why don't you teach? And I just sat up and I thought, wow, that's a great idea. And I went down to my local community center and I said, you need someone to teach meditation classes? And the person who was there said, yeah, fill out a proposal and let's see what we can do. And that was the
Mhm.
beginning. That was probably 16, 17 years ago.
Wow. Your wife sounds brilliant.
She has moments of stunning brilliance, and the interesting thing is like all of us, she doesn't always catch them. It's for us to catch. And I was like,
Right.
wow, that was a great moment. Good call.
Okay, so then when did you get to the point where, okay, you said you were associated with two different communities at that
Yeah.
time. And did you continue that relationship with both communities, or did you branch off and choose one to like embed yourself into a little bit more?
Yeah, they were really successive. So there was an overlap between the two, but
Hmm.
one sort of my involvement with one eased into my involvement with the other. So, the first one I was probably involved from, let's say, 1991 to 2000, roughly, and maybe 2002. The second
Hmm.
one, there was a bit of an overlap. I was involved from 1999 to February of 2020.
Wow,
So
that's a long time.
the last one was a long time. It was a 20-year relationship when it finally
Mm.
came to an end.
Do you want to share that story?
Why don't we share that story?
I think we should.
Yeah, and so I think we've got a really good sense of kind of what brought me into that second situation. And it started in 1999. Actually, my first program in that particular community with that particular leader was over the Y2K New Year. So it started in December 1999. The first program ended in January 2000. And as we've hinted towards, I worked there for a long time. And around about 2016, my relationship with the whole situation started to fray a little bit. I started to feel uncomfortable. And I think that's probably the best word for it if we go back to 2016, just kind of like, something is going on here. I started to feel uncomfortable with the way that the leader treated his students, specifically his close, long-term, most involved and devoted students, people like myself. And over the next couple of years, that discomfort did nothing but intensify. And it eventually became apparent to me that in spite of what I'd been told, and in spite of what I believed, and in spite of what I told other people as a leader myself in that community, as a senior person in that community, what was driving that community was not the teachings and the practices of meditation. It wasn't the well-being and development of students or senior students, if I want to be more specific about that, but it was the self-centered impulses of the leader. And the extents that he was willing to go to assert these impulses really created an environment that was characterized by manipulation and disempowerment and disrespect. And to kind of flesh this out a little bit, he was a master of what I call the bait and switch, meaning promising one thing, we're going to do this, let's look at this. And then when people begin orienting in that direction, pulling it away and introducing something else. Well, no, we're going to do that, or just forgetting all about it completely, with the implicit expectation that we are all just going to silently go along with the switch. And it doesn't, I think, maybe on one level, it doesn't sound like much. It's like, well, okay, he's not very good at agreements and commitments, but that doesn't sound awful. But, when this dynamic repeats over years, and when plans and schedules and even lives are upended by the bait and switch, all by an authority figure that one trusts, who seems to have little concern for the consequences of his actions, the effect is actually crazy making. And I don't mean that figuratively. The effect is crazy making. And so through all 2019, I struggled with what I was seeing and what I was beginning to understand was going on here. And I struggled on so many levels. I think most significantly, though, I struggled with the fact that my own inner knowing, this innate quality that we all have about what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, what's going on, what's not going on here. My own inner knowing was so regularly undermined by this manipulative, disrespectful, disempowering individual and collective dynamic. And so I struggled all through 2019. And at a certain point, my physical and my mental well-being had become so compromised. I mean, I wasn't sleeping, I was having trouble eating, I was anxious all the time, my stomach hurt, my head hurt. My whole system had become so compromised that for survival reason, I just had to leave. And part of me wishes I could say it was a principled move, it was an ethical move, I was taking a stand, and in some ways I was taking a stand, but the stand was for my own survival. I couldn't stay in that situation any longer. And so in February 2020, I made this difficult but necessary choice that, curiously, not to underscore the difficulty, but curiously has opened up not only a path of recovery and healing, but also an path of exploration and discovery that continues to this day. And so that was the story of the conclusion of my training in that second community.
I know when you were telling the story, you says, well, it might not sound like much, but for those who are listening, if you've had a spiritual mentor or some sort of mentor that, you followed for quite a long time and trusted, it's almost like having the rug pulled out from underneath you. It's the sense of betrayal is it's almost palpable. I mean, even when you're telling the story, I could go through that experience with you, and I'm going on that roller coaster ride and then trying to decide, do I stay? Do I leave? Do I stay? Do I leave? And it takes a tremendous amount of courage to be able to make that decision to say, no, I'm done. I'm stepping away from this. And then, like you said, when you did that, all of these wonderful new paths opened up.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard all over the place, of course, in some languages, the translations of for crisis is opportunity. I've heard those. I've seen the little, slogans on Facebook and my Facebook feed and all that kind of stuff. To actually come face to face with the truth of that has really been quite astonishing in my own experience. It's really been quite eye-opening. I wouldn't wish what I've been through on anyone, and yet at a certain level, I do feel a lot of gratitude for it.
Yeah, I agree that crisis gives you the opportunity, and it takes your life to a completely different level. But when you're going through it, that's a whole different story.
Yes. And I want to be clear too. The going through is something that continues to this day. Very early on, so probably I left in February 2020, let's say April or May of 2020, someone who'd been through something similar in a different community. They'd been part of a community for 22 years, and then the behavior of the leader led them to depart. They said to me, you should give yourself 10 years for this. And I thought, no, 10 years, 1 year, I'll be fine.
Yeah.
10 years, 2.5 years later, 10 years makes a lot of sense to me. And so there's still a lot of going through in an active sense. And yet there is a going through, there is a process that's unfolding. And it does have that quality of exploration and discovery, of opportunity to it.
So I'm really curious. I wonder, and I'm not sure if you could answer this or not, but I'm wondering if this man, I mean, he almost sounds like he's an egomaniac. And I'm wondering, did he have some of these qualities when you first started training with him and working with him, but you did not recognize them? Or did he develop some of these idiosyncrasies, let's just call them, or pathologies, as he was going on, with his students? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I mean, that is one of the mysterious questions that maybe I'm going to be asking myself for the rest of my life. Certainly, there was a strong sense of confidence apparent from the very first time I met this individual. And I can easily look back and kind of see how this confidence became, or was at the time, a very closed system situation, a very closed system confidence, which is really what facilitates the kind of dynamics that we were talking about. I think the qualities were always there. To what extent, I'm really not clear. That's the mystery that I'm going to be exploring, I think, for the rest of my life. The qualities were certainly always there. For a long time, they felt helpful, beneficial. Were they truly, really helpful, beneficial? That's another question I'm going to get to entertain. What is clear is that at a certain point, it became obvious to me that the downsides to those qualities far, far, far outweighed the upsides.
When you left, were there any repercussions from this person? Was he shocked? Did he try and contact you, try and bring you back into the fold? Or did he just like, okay, best of luck, Godspeed?
Yeah, it was pretty much best of luck, Godspeed. And, we talked a few moments ago, or I spoke about, that kind of a closed system quality to his confidence. And that really characterized the whole community. It's not something that I really recognized when I was in it. Of course, you're not going to recognize it when you're in it. But when I stepped out, it, became really clear to me that yes, there was a very, closed, I mean, I keep using that phrase, closed system quality, because when I stepped out, there was a practical sense and an energetic sense that my relationship with him, my relationship with that community, my relationship with many of the peers who have remained within, were done.
Do you feel like it was almost cult-like?
It was certainly cult-like. I mean, I did a lot of trauma therapy. I continue to do a lot of trauma therapy and working through this. And the person that I work with, who his background is EMDR, for people who know that, who's really wonderful. And we really don't talk much. I mean, it's basically just about experiencing the visceral sense of what we've been through. And so, he just lets the experience flow. And every once in a while, he'll say, okay, just check in. What's going on? Great. Let's keep going. He rarely disrupts the flow of this. And one day, he leaned forward, and I had been reporting some things. And he said, do you ever wonder if you were involved in a cult? And I don't use formal words like cult. I don't use easily. And so I asked him, can you define that term for me? What do you mean by cult? And some of the things he talked about was extreme hierarchy, centralized control, a sense of in-group versus out-group, a special mission or ideology, an orientation that at the end of the day seems to benefit the leaders as opposed to the students. And every characteristic that he offered, the checkbox was marked. And at that point, I nodded and I said, yeah, I think I was part of a cult. And that is certainly one way of describing the situation. And it's a way that I find helpful because it describes the behavior of an individual or individuals and the social context that evolves around them, the atmosphere that evolves around them. And both of those were part of that situation for me. And so, cult is, I think, an appropriate label to apply to the situation.
And when I asked before about, did you notice any of this, like at the beginning, another idea or word that popped into my head was habituation and grooming. So it's kind of like a slow burn. It's like, okay, well, this is making me a little bit uncomfortable, but then, oh, it works out okay. And so then it's, escalates a little bit more, and people get very masterful at that, at manipulating others and knowing when to push, and when to pull back.
Yes.
And I think that's how people like that, pull their students in.
I think that's very much the case. And, for me, one of the bridge that went too far, I think, was being brought in a little bit closer to the center than I had been in the past. Geographically, the situation is based in Colorado. I'm in British Columbia. There's a big distance between us. And so while I was a senior person, in some ways I wasn't at the center of a lot of the problematic dynamics. And there was a certain point where I was invited into a group of senior people who ostensibly were being, trained to eventually assume leadership in this community, which of course never happened. But it was that context, stepping into that extent, where I started to see how this individual treated others of his senior students. And, meeting after meeting after meeting, I would just be like, yeah, this isn't okay. This isn't okay. This isn't dignified. This isn't respectful. This isn't empowering. This isn't kind. This isn't decent. This isn't
Mhm.
appropriate. And there was a very long period of like, kind of, well, that seems a little bit weird, but on the whole, it's a good situation. Well, that seems a little bit off, but on a whole, it's a good situation.
Mhm.
Well, that's a little bit out of line, but it doesn't happen that much. And then
Mhm.
here I am in this, for me, which was a white hot center. And it was just, um, pretty much every meeting from start to finish, I was
Wow.
just like, this is not okay. But of course, I didn't have the words to articulate that because I was so habituated in the other direction. So there was this
Yeah.
massive dissonance, which I'm sure is
Mhm.
where all those where a lot of those mental and physical symptoms came from. This massive dissonance going on in me
Mhm.
throughout these, I can't remember whether they're 1 or 2 hour meetings, just,
Oh,
my system was
God.
just screaming as we went through this, biweekly after biweekly. And, that exposure was really what, kind of broke the spell, so to speak. And I think that's a good way of talking about it, break the spell, because I feel
Mhm.
like um, I was invited into the land of Oz and I
Mhm.
walked all the way to the end of the Yellow Brick Road and I went into the castle and went back to the wizard's room. And when I was back in the wizard's room, the curtain was pulled back. And
Mhm.
those group meetings for, assuming leadership in the community in the years ahead, um, those were the moments at which that curtain was pulled back. And back to your term, the habituation was perforated enough that I was able to see, yeah, this is not okay.
Wow. That's it sounds like what you're describing, it sounds like the antithesis of what meditation is supposed to be.
I think once again, you're talking about it. You're raising an issue that I think I'm going to be wrestling with and exploring for a very long time,
Mhm.
which is how much was this experience, how much did it involve a distortion of what meditation is, of what the teachings are, and of what we as human beings can be.
Mhm.
And I think that distortion, in some ways, it was very dramatic. In some ways, it
Mhm.
was very subtle. But I think that distortion is, as I begin to look back in this regard, I think it was really quite profound. So yeah, I think your finger's definitely on something. It
And
definitely
this
antithetical.
this is a perfect segue into what you're doing now and how you work with people. When did you launch your own program, and when did you
Yeah.
start working with people? And you're doing a fabulous job of it, from as far as I can tell.
Well, thank you. So let's go back. So it's February 2020, and I've
Mhm.
left this community and this difficult but necessary choice. And, so there was a lot of relief at leaving. I remember sleeping 14, 16 hours a day for several days, you
Wow.
know, on end. But the experience of loss at the same time was overwhelming. I mean, I'd lost a
Mhm.
path, I'd lost peers, I'd lost livelihood, trust, confidence, direction, and so on and so forth. And I had no idea what to do with this. I mean, I was lost. So I had
Mhm.
no idea what to do with this. And there was a couple of interesting things that came out of this lostness. So the first thing is, so basically what I'm going to be talking about here before I talk about what I'm doing now is the recovery process that evolved for me.
Mhm.
How did I begin to recover and heal from this? So a couple of things came out of this lostness. And the first thing was meditation. For
Mhm.
whatever reason, and it's like back on sitting on that sleeping bag on that rainy evening in Vancouver in like 1980 or whatever it was. I can't explain why this was the case, but for whatever reason, I leave this community and I turn to what's familiar to me. I turn to meditation and I practice almost every day. And through this, I started to settle into what was happening for me. I started to settle into that lostness, not changing, not getting rid of, not transforming, but settling
Mhm.
into the lostness. And as I settled in, there was this experience of insight that constantly arose that spoke directly to what was happening to me, directly to that lostness that I was immersed in.
Mhm.
And that really suggested a phase of meditation that had always been there, but I'd never recognized before. One in which I let the insights that arise out of my settling into, and that's basically how meditation is often described. You settle into, and there's insights. So I let the insights that arise out of settling into what's going on for me, I let these insights begin to guide me into and through my life, which is what I started doing because I didn't know what else to do. I mean, I was
Mhm.
lost, Cheryl. And just to be clear, if what arose in meditation suggested that I was tired, I would rest.
Mhm.
If it was loneliness, I would reach out. If there was a sense of stuckness, I would seek out trauma therapy, as I've already mentioned. So it was very ground level. And it was like
Mhm.
nothing I'd ever experienced in any of the meditation texts I've read. So that was one thing that started to show up in this lostness. The second thing that's worth noting is much of my practice in the last couple of years has been done in community. It's been done with others. You know, with
Mhm.
the end of this difficult relationship and the arrival of COVID in early 2020, the two were very much, one after the other. My teaching livelihood vanished. And so I started offering something online that's evolved into the community that I now call the online gatherings. And in doing so, and coming together and meditating in a group context, I got to see the brilliant and articulate ways, the vulnerable and adaptive ways that others were not only engaging meditation, but meeting the stuff of their lives. And these two were profoundly affecting to me because
Mhm.
with these two, much to my surprise, I found myself moving through my loss and grief, not getting over because there's still a lot of really rough days, but
Mhm.
finding my way through with meditation practice, beginning to heal my relationship with my own inner wisdom that was so compromised
Mm.
in that previous situation, and with the community members affirming and modeling the existence of this basic knowing, this inherent
Mhm.
dignity over and over and over again, just by their willingness to show up and be themselves.
Mhm.
So I discovered that we are far more resourced than I ever imagined. And I started to find a sense of direction and purpose that informs my life, certainly, and it also informs the work that I do, which
Mhm.
finally getting to your question, but maybe I'll pause there.
I love that inherent dignity.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how situations can really rattle that, or how people are so ready to take away your dignity, take
Yeah.
away your self-respect, try and belittle you. And like I said, especially in that type of a community, you wouldn't expect it, but you know, predators and pathology is everywhere, pretty much.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Very much so.
And tell us again the name of your community.
Uh, so the online gatherings, because,
Mhm.
and the name, I keep thinking, oh, I should rename it, but it just so describes what we do. We come online and we gather together. It's
Mhm.
the online gatherings.
Oh,
And
okay.
what this is it's a group of people who believe, who sense, who hope, who yearn that meditation can connect us with something important
Mhm.
in our lives, the wisdom that is inherent in our person, in our relationships, in our world.
Mhm.
And so we come together to develop a really practical understanding of the teachings and practices of meditation, one that resonates with our everyday life, so that we can then encourage and empower one another, inspire and support one another as we become more familiar with and respectful of that inner wisdom and of the unique ways that it manifests in all of our paths and all of our lives. So that's
Now,
what the gatherings do.
when you talk about things like inherent dignity, inherent wisdom,
Yeah.
is that why you refer to what you do as embodied meditation?
It can be, yes. Embodied meditation, what we're doing with embodied meditation is bringing our attention back to the immediacy of our embodied experience right now,
Mhm.
by which I mean the experience of this apparently bounded body, the experience of our sense organs, which allows us a relationship with
Mhm.
the world, the
Mhm.
experience of the earth underneath. We're bringing our attention back to what's happening right now in this moment. And in so doing, in settling into this, there's that phrase again, we begin to touch something that's fundamental to us. And so, yes, I'm now coming to the place of saying yes to your question, because I'd never quite heard it articulated that way. Yes, we begin to develop a relationship with, a familiarity and a relationship with qualities that are basic in our human being. And by basic, what that means is they're inherent, they're fundamental, they're innate. They're there if we are having a good day or a bad day. They're there if our hair is long or short, if we wear glasses or we don't wear glasses, if we're a meditator or we're not a meditator. They are basic, fundamental, inherent qualities in our human being. And meditation in general, embodied meditation specifically, is in large part about developing a familiarity, a relationship, and a fidelity to this. And that's really at the heart of what we're doing in the online gatherings.
Oh gosh, that almost gave me chills. I mean, that's beautiful the way that you said that.
Well, it's been a beautiful journey of, what did I call it? Exploration and discovery, because I wouldn't have spoken this way 2.5 years ago. This is very much a perspective and experience and understanding that's come out of everything that's gone on since I said, yeah, I'm done.
It's very profound.
It's been very profound. It's been shaking, earth shaking.
Are there days when you don't even know your own name?
There are days when I kind of sit here and I feel like, do you remember that old Talking Heads song? How did I get here? This is not my beautiful house.
Yes.
Days go by. That's what I feel like a lot of the time. How did I get here?
I think a lot of us go through that. I sit here and I look at some of my surroundings. I look at the swords behind me and my belts over there on that other wall, and I go, how did that happen?
Yeah, I think that's why that song is so resonant.
Yeah, right. Okay, so tell us a little bit more about your practice, how people can get a hold of you with your online and in-person type of practices. Anything that you want to tell us about, how people can work with you.
Yeah, well, you can, of course, find me in all the usual places: Facebook, Instagram. My podcast, which is called Bringing Meditation to Life, is one way of talking about this work. Okay. Bringing Meditation to Life is hosted on all the usual outlets. But in my opinion, the best way to check me out is my website. And that is neilmckinlay.com. And as you and I talked about before we began, I'm a rare McKinlay with an L-A-Y. So it sounds like McKinlay, but it's McKinlay is how it's spelled. neilmckinlay.com. And this gives you a good sense of everything that I'm doing on the site. And, there's writings, there's guided meditations, and there's also information about this subscription-based community that I've mentioned a number of times. It's really at the heart of my work, which is the online gatherings. But that's a great place to go. Check things out. There's a newsletter there. I always encourage people to sign up for the newsletter, because as it shows up, you become more familiar with the range and the rhythm of what I'm offering. And every month when something shows up in your mailbox, you're reminded that meditation might have something to offer in your life. And that's something I've learned from others. I tell the story quite frequently of running into people who say, oh, I get your newsletter. I really like your newsletter. I said, oh, so you open it up and you read it? Well, no, I never open it up and I never read it. And I'm like, well, then why do you like it? And they say, well, because every time it shows up, it reminds me that maybe meditation has something to offer my life. And that is such a great outcome for all of us, I think. So, this thing will show up, it'll say meditation update, and it's a little reminder like, okay, maybe this has something to offer. Maybe this has something to offer. If you're so inspired and if you're so able, come give it a shot. So.
Oh, that's great. I just set out my newsletter this morning. So if people aren't opening it, I could say, but at least they're paying attention and they like it.
It's true. Funny. For a moment, it captures our always flittering attention.
Yes. Yes. And you do have a beautiful website. And I did want to ask one more question about, because I know you're an author.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know you had a podcast. So, and I usually do a pretty deep dive, and I stalk my guests pretty thoroughly and go through all their social media and stuff. So I didn't know that. Do you have a book?
I have, my days as an author are a little bit in the past at this point. I wrote a book just as my swimming coaching career was ending called Learning to Swim.
Ooh,
And it's
okay.
out of print now, but it's Learning to Swim, and it's nonfiction stories about my life as a swimmer and a life as a coach, and really how that those experiences have reminded me of what we're talking about here. The basic dignity of our human lives, our fundamental awareness, clarity, tenderness, responsiveness. All those qualities were in abundant evidence to me when I was a swimmer and coach. And so it's,
Mhm.
kind of stories that touch on that. As I
Okay.
said, it's out of, so, you can probably find it on some used
Hmm.
book websites out there.
Hmm.
But for those who are curious, that's the name, Learning to Swim, Reflections on Living.
Okay. Well, then I have another question for you. I don't know, you might not want to answer it, and that's fine. Um, is there another book in your future?
I would love that to be the case. As we've talked about, my stepping into this life that I'm currently leading in some ways is fairly new,
Hmm.
2.5 years. And my learning curve in this particular life is proving really quite steep.
Hmm.
I have to learn about what microphones to use when I'm doing podcast interviews,
Yeah.
for instance. That doesn't just happen. And
No.
so, as this learning curve, the steepness descends, I would
Mhm.
like to be able to do more long form writing. And so I'd like to say the answer to that question is yes.
Because I can see it. Not only can I see it, I can feel it with this experience, everything that you went through. And I think it would be a fantastic book.
Well, thank you for that encouragement. That does sink in and kind of get some gears working.
Hmm. And when you do, then you can contact me and we can have you back on the show. And so you can tell us about the process of writing the book, what it's about, how it's doing, because I could just see it, I could feel it. And even I didn't read a lot of your blogs, but I went through some of the titles.
Mhm.
And that's a wonderful way to get started in creating an outline or an idea for your books. That's how both of my books started, with a couple of my blog posts put together. And it's like, hey, that's pretty good. I can really elaborate on that. So you need to let me know.
You got it. It's a date.
All righty then. Okay, well, Neil, thank you so much for being on the show. I've loved this conversation. Is there any final little pearls of wisdom that you would like to drop on the audience about meditation, about relationships, anything? There's one other thing I meant to ask you, and I didn't. Something that you had in your bio, take 5 minutes to meditate. If you can just briefly talk about that too, I'd love it, because I'm somebody who has a really hard time meditating.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, you know, take 5 minutes to meditate. 5 minute meditation speaks to one of the key themes in the work that I do. Earlier when I was talking about the online gatherings, I talked about developing a practical understanding of the teachings and practices of meditation.
Mhm.
And one of the ways that that practicalness manifests is with regard to time.
Mm.
If I set out an hour-long meditation, a 40-minute meditation, a 30-minute meditation, a 20-minute meditation, well, what are you going to do if you, for instance, are the parent of a young child who yearn to meditate, but look at 15 minutes and go like, I don't have 15 minutes. And so one of the things that I do try to do is bring the bar down for us in so many different levels. And the 5 minute meditation is an excellent example of that. So it's just a simple meditation practice put within a framework that we can do. 5 minute meditation I use because it sounds good, but we can do it in a minute. We can do it
Mm.
in 8 minutes. And it simply involves sitting where we are, letting our spine slightly lengthen, turning our attention toward whatever we're experiencing right now. And when that attention wanders, which it will, I'm going to repeat that. When that attention wanders, which it will, just gently bringing it back to this, the room we're in, the floor underfoot, the seat we're sitting on, in and out of our breath. And that's it.
Simple enough. Even I can do that.
That's the intention. Simple enough so that all of us can, take advantage of, let's go back to the beginning of our conversation, take advantage of this tool in our life.
Excellent.
So you asked about that, and then you asked about, one piece of advice that I might pass.
Yep.
The final pearl of wisdom. Well, I mean, this has really been one of the revelations of my own experience. And if you remember the journey that I laid out and the process of recovery and healing that I talked about, the journey begins here. And that's not just words. It's actually how the journey begins. We find our dignity, our integrity, our purpose, our path, by turning our attention toward and finding whatever help we need, whatever support we need to be able to do this, by turning our attention toward what's happening in our life right now, and then waiting for that next step to appear. And so it's right here. It's right now with this. I think that's been one of the more revelational insights of my experience in the last couple of years, is that here I am, literally on the floor, feeling overwhelmed and lost. And that is the place that the journey begins for me.
Excellent.
Yeah. So
thank you so much for that. And Neil, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been absolutely fantastic. I've learned a lot, and you have an amazing story and an amazing delivery. Your energy is so calming and so kind, and human dignity, which is something we all need a little bit more of, right?
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you to everyone who's listening. And yes, I think, we live in what we could say are some very challenging times, and human dignity, connecting with our basic human dignity in the midst of this seems a very, very worthwhile undertaking, bringing that dignity into our lives.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you again. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
And everybody, thank you for listening. As always, I really appreciate you as well. And do check out Neil's website. He's got a lot of fantastic information on it. Go ahead and stalk him on social media. I'm sure he won't mind. I have the website, all the links and everything will be in the show notes. So, but I always enjoy the guest being able to give the information. So that is all I have to say about that. And make sure that you start focusing on human dignity. Think about that. We all need a little bit more of that in our lives. And maybe one by one, we can make this world a better place. I certainly hope so. And that is the way of the FemiNinja.